Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Brian. It is Monday, new week, new theme. This week's theme is going to be the mid-year checkpoint. 2026 is, well, at this point, a little over halfway finished, and I'm kind of curious what some of y'all's favorites of the year have been so far. We're going to kick this off with a band called URNE. I don't believe I've heard of them before. We're looking at the track Setting Fire to the Sky, which is the title track of the album of the same name. Let's dive in, see what URNE is bringing to the table today. Okay, very cool rhythm for 4/4. Layered vocals. Dude, they love to play around with accent patterns. Oh, the clean vocals on the most intense drum section so far. The guitars out to the side.
Breaking through the grave, walls of sanity guiding the way, showing palms, showing belief, showing palms, showing belief.
It feels like we lose a beat somewhere in between the verse and this pre-chorus. That snare, man, just cutting through everything. Lots of whammy on there. Oh, that's bent. It's nice to hear a different harmonic palette. So bringing back the rhythm of the intro. Double time though, I think. Maybe not double time, actually. I think that we've just reduced all of the space between each of those guitar patterns with however long they were the first time through at the very beginning of the track. Now they're just one beat. So it feels like we're progressing through the idea faster, but I don't actually think the guitar part is faster than it was at the beginning. But a very nice way to bring that back, because nothing else in the song really has that sort of syncopated rhythmic stuff to it. It was something that was really just relegated to the beginning, and they found a way to bring it back in a way that fit into the sound that they were generally approaching in the rest of the track, finding a way of integrating the intro, which felt separated previously, into the song at large, and creating a new outro by combining both of their approaches. Yeah, very cool way to wrap that up. A little indulgent there at the end, but you know, there's still consistent change throughout. It's not like it was just one static idea. So I do appreciate that, at least. You know, this just is not my cup of tea. It's very groovy, very riff-based track. It is heavy. They've got a ton of energy on this. And I'll give them credit for all that, dude. But this is like metal to the core, right? Not like metalcore, but like it's just like a solid metal track right here. And they're doing a lot of cool things on it. And the first thing I got to shout out though is the drums. So the drummer actually really intrigues me, and maybe the guitars are part of this too, because quite frequently the rhythmic components are shared between these two instruments in everywhere except the chorus, where the guitars in an isolated state shift away from riffs into atmosphere and texture. Everywhere else though, the guitars are very rhythmic in their riffage and oftentimes line up with the drums. So maybe this isn't just for the drums right here, but they are what I feel leads this track rhythmically. So I'm going to associate this to the drums for this conversation here. The drummer is very interesting in how they phrase things. The verse is mostly 4 on the floor, as long as you're feeling that halftime 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. I feel like that's a bit slow for the energy they're delivering, but that's how I ended up counting it out. And that would give us a snare hit on every single beat. This is actually consistent with later on what feels like not a full double time, but certainly a drastic tempo increase. And we're just getting a constant snare all the time. This was through the bridge when I pointed out just how prominent the snare sound is in the mix. And so having this 4 on the floor, snare on every single beat kind of idea is actually pretty consistent throughout this track. But what I find interesting is when we shift away from this, there's an entire section in the pre-chorus, which I kind of view as not the 4 on the floor chorus, verse section, but not the atmospheric approach with the clean vocals that we hear in the chorus. There's a part in between. At times, though, I think it was the second verse, it felt just as long as the verse itself, so I think it's kind of weird to call it a pre-chorus. Maybe it's just an extension of the verse, but there is a drastic alteration to the rhythmic stuff in here. First of all, the snare gets super syncopated. I find it kind of difficult to figure out when they're going to play next. Sometimes it'll be static, where they are just quarter notes, syncopated quarter notes, not on the downbeat itself, but still a rather consistent spacing between each hit. And then other times it'll change it up and we'll get only an eighth note on one of them. And then that'll lead us into something that feels like it accents the downbeats again, even though we were accenting the offbeats. But then there also feels like there is a beat that gets lost somewhere, and where I thought we were emphasizing, like, I don't know, 1 and 3 on the guitars, now we're emphasizing 2 and 4, and that's different from where my head's bobbing because that was hitting the 1 and the 3. And I had 2 chances at this, after the first verse and after the second verse, and I still never quite figured out what was going on in here. Both times I was thrown off quite a bit. I wager that if I were exclusively focusing on the rhythmic and temporal side of things, I'd probably have this down in one more listen. But it is one of the things in here that I find really interesting because so much of this track feels like heavy stomping. It is not what I would necessarily call a dexterous track. It is aggressive and weighty in a lot of ways. And so I find that this sort of temporal confusion, that the time signature of this track kind of gets a little wonky here, as maybe there's time signature changes. Maybe there's a single bar of 3/4 that throws the whole thing out of whack, or maybe the drummer just chooses to start emphasizing odd parts where it feels like we lose a beat, but if you keep counting that 4, we eventually still wrap up on 8 bars of 4 or something like that. Regardless, it is very interesting to get through this moment, and the fact it threw me twice is, well, quite interesting to me. Prog can throw me off, especially if you're playing with something that's just constantly changing time signatures. You know, your Dance of Eternity from Dream Theater. I'm not going to be able to pick that up on several listens, but this is fairly straightforward through most of it. And I still have in my gut that I feel the time signature stuff is also still fairly straightforward there. And the fact that I didn't pick up on it, I don't know, it intrigues me. I gotta know what's going on there because it shouldn't. It feels simple. And so I got to give him credit for that. There is some playfulness rhythmically in this track that makes it more interesting than how I perceived it from the start. And I probably should have, talking about from the start, picked that up from the intro, but honestly I had forgotten about the chunky jaggedness of the intro of this track until we hit the finale again, because so much of this song is a fair bit more straightforward. Now, I talked about the riffs in here, just kind of briefly mentioned that they are pretty sick, and yeah, that might be a bit of an understatement. I think part of it is the production. These guitar tones just sound incredible, and the entire mix of this track is fantastic. Despite as prominent as that snare is, I do feel it's rather balanced within the general sound of everything. The dual layers of the vocals are clear, the guitars are clear, the bass is clear. Like, there's good clarity without losing that crunchy grittiness that metal really needs. It's balanced between clarity of hearing and grittiness of sound. And so the guitar riffs, I think really anything these guitarists play are going to sound good as a bass line. Even the worst riffs are going to sound great in this tone, in this production. But the riffs themselves are still really great too. There's bite to them, there's edge, there's sharpness, but there's also a nice bit of well, I mentioned this wasn't a really dexterous track, but I do think that there are some cool movements within the guitars, emphasizing with a little bit of syncopation within their accented hits that push against what the drums are doing at times. And while it is not some of the most light rhythmic stuff we've heard, light on their toes, it is still not just completely locked into rigidity either. But the riffs themselves also sound sick, usually have some sort of pedal tone throughout, which is just a great way of building intensity. Some little bit of movement from that. Usually that dominates the first 3/4 of the riff, and then the final quarter of the riff is some cool movement, usually some sort of rising idea or falling idea. It is a bit more of a traditional way of writing riffs, but something about it here just sounds great. Maybe they are doing something just a little bit more than most metal bands would be doing, even while following traditional blueprints, a little bit of variation on top of traditional ideas, something to put their stamp on something a bit more iterative. But you can't deny that it just sounds great. As I mentioned at the beginning of the track, or the beginning of this analysis, this isn't really my cup of tea. I'm not going to go out of my way to check out some URNE later on today, but despite that, I still couldn't stop grooving to this. There was basically no part in this reaction where I stopped moving my body or bobbing my head. The song just invites that in every element. And I do think a lot of it comes down to the guitar work. It is just really great. Two more sections I want to bring up then. The vocals. I actually really dug the layered vocals. The lower harsh that kind of dominates the majority of the sounds is fine. Not usually my favorite kind of harsh, but I really liked it paired with the harsh that felt like it was pushed into the backgrounds. It was a bit higher pitched and almost sounded like there was a little bit of clean vocals in there too. Something that felt a little closer to a yell while still having a guttural element of false chord screaming. I'm very intrigued about that style, but I think it sounds great pushed into the back as an additional texture to the main lower end stuff that we have at the forefront. And then also having the clean vocals in the chorus was great. I am a sucker for clean vocals in metal. Clean vocals in metal. And I thought they sounded great, particularly against the atmosphere of everything. The bass and the drums are filling out this entire space in the middle, and the guitars have been shifted from sort of center, left and right, out to the outskirts of the track, both as texture with chords, but also with these little ornamental ideas, just arising 4 pitches at the end of every phrase, give or take. I thought this section was fantastic. You really feel this weight pushing down upon you with those double bass kicks and the largeness of the bass guitar, but then you have this rising pattern from the guitars that almost feels like we are rising up or evolving or growing spiritually through this compressing sound, increasing something about us despite this force pushing us downward. It's a very cool mixed idea of pressure and release simultaneously that works really well at presenting this almost musical oxymoron, something that shouldn't exist, but it's escalation through pressure. Very cool idea there. And the whole chorus, I think, really gets tied together by having these clean vocals just sort of belting out over everything. I don't think this section would have worked as well with harshes, particularly because the cleans tie into some of this elation, this growth that the guitars allude to, but I think are really explored through the vocals here, where growls would have just felt like they tied into what the drums and bass are doing and creating this weight that pushes down. And I don't think it would have been as balanced. So just really great idea in that section. The last thing I want to bring up then is the bridge. We have a cool guitar solo in here. I had mentioned when the solo ended that it was nice to hear some harmonic expansion. I feel like the riffs themselves are a bit muted in the note choices they have. They're restricted. The solo took that as a baseline, added a few more notes to it, and explored a larger palette of color. So I do like the general atmosphere and sound that the guitar brought into play with those new notes. It changed the harmonic components of this track and featured something that it felt a bit, I don't know. It's interesting because I can't quite place the chord. I'm not great at naming chords, but I'm usually great at assigning emotion to chordal ideas. And here I'm a bit lost. It feels fairly nuanced. It still has some of the bite and aggression of the main riffs, but that's been softened up a little bit by the expanded note choices. And through that, we find something that it's not just softer, but it's kind of like sour candy or spicy food, where the joy is through the pain. There's something in here that still brings about tension, a little bit of dissonance and bite, but it's better. I don't know if that makes any sense. I think this just ties well into the chorus's idea of duality, of finding growth through compression, of opposites impacting each other and creating something new out of it. But regardless, I did enjoy what was going on there. There's some cool bends in here, which we don't really hear in the main guitar part either. We have vibrato through the use of heavy whammy bar, which, again, vibrato is not something you would usually use in tandem with another instrument. It is typically used for solos, but it is another texture that's used within the solo section that helps, again, just kind of strengthen this song as a whole, to give it more musical verbs, more tools to work with, and helps diversify the general sound of the track. I think that if the solo had stuck with ideas that were closer to the core riffs, it would end up feeling too homogenous, and 6.5 minutes of that would wear me down personally. There's certainly been tracks in the past where I'm like, this was cool for like 4 minutes, but I was certainly over it by the end. And I'd mentioned that the end of this track feels a bit indulgent to me. Hanging on to that final riff for a full minute almost, and just finding more ways to reduce the layers of it until we hit like a core bass line, a blueprint of the riff itself. But I do think that I would have been more fatigued earlier had the solo not have explored a new harmonic palette. There's also just some cool techniques in there in general, and I feel like the flow of it is great. A lot of solos feel stilted where, you know, we're going to do 4 bars of this descending pattern, and then we're going to do 4 bars of sweeping, and then 4 bars of shredding. This feels like we're naturally moving between ideas in a melodic fashion, not a block fashion. And I really appreciate that. So yeah, dude, this is a solid track though. Heavy, groovy, riffy, everything you want in a solid metal track while still just sounding great. The production is phenomenal on this. Maybe a little too clean for some of y'all lower compression or higher compression, lower fidelity fans out there. But I find that this production style works really well for this and makes everything sound super punchy. Let's hit some lyrics on this and see what's going on there. I'd love to hear someone's interpretation of this. There's certainly the metaphor of setting fire to the sky. It is said here through a more literal sense, though I still feel it has a figurative second layer to it. But it talks about setting fire to the sky, seeing the color, and feeling the heat charge through. Towards the end, it says we won't fall before this world, and we won't fall before the dark. And there's one line about the sun. And of course, I'm completely missing that. Something about the sun rising from the earth. Nah, maybe I'll find it in a second. Oh, there it is. And when the sun rises from the earth, we will rejoice. So that's an interesting line right there. The sun rising from the earth. Normally, when we think of a sunrise, we think of it rising overhead, but of course, that's due to the rotation of the earth, not the sun moving itself. Regardless, the sun rising from the earth. I've tried to look at this many angles, and I don't get it. There's certainly a metaphorical thing here. But the thing is that there is this heat change There is a feeling of getting hot. There is a feeling of no darkness. It says that we will deny damnation, locked in hands. We are moving forward and we will rejoice. You should sing with us. No more fear. Our vision is clear. So whatever this thing is, it seems destructive in some ways. There's certainly the heating up and stuff like this. But there's also the fact that no more fear. Vision will always be clear. It says that we can basically live in light, and traditionally light is used to represent clarity, vision, information, knowledge. We are enlightened when we learn things. Light is quite typically used as a positive notion of information. And so living without fear and not living in a dark world, all of this is about bringing light to the world. Constant, infinite light, never being without information. That part seems positive. And we do have this group of people who are locked hand in hand, moving forward, singing about setting fire to the sky. Through the sun rising from the earth. That all sounds fairly positive. But there's also a part of this that feels apocalyptic, almost as if this group is some sort of death cult praising the end of the earth. The sun burning out this planet. It says it'll be a glorious sight. The screaming will be loud, heads will turn above, eyes will turn to the sky. A glorious sight, fear and horror will drain from our skin. That's the first verse and pre-chorus. The rest of it feels more positive, but there's a horrific element to it all. The world's edge, a kingdom's peak. We will scream loud and our heads turn above to see a glorious sight. And so I find that I don't quite know the perspective of this, and it could be a skewed perspective entirely. The enlightenment is that there will be no more darkness because the place will be burned up. It is death cult plus light metaphor as good combined, because if it is told through the eyes of a follower of this cult, a cultist, if you will, then this is all positive. The destruction is a positive thing. But I wonder too if maybe the apocalyptic death cult thing is not really what it's aiming to be. And I'm just getting that because of the more horror-coded vocabulary of the first verse. Because I'll be honest, the rest of this doesn't really push in that direction. It all looks at the positivity of whatever this is, whatever the setting fire to the sky is. Regardless, there's certainly a positive bend to all of this, even if at times I feel I don't find it as positive. But I'm still looking at this as something cataclysmic. Maybe, the sun burning up the planet as the sun is brought up. But maybe setting fire to the sky is supposed to represent something else, and I'm just not able to figure out what that is. And maybe that will make things seem a bit more positive. Regardless, that is why I kicked this off, saying that I'm interested in other people's perspective on this. I don't think I have a strong grasp here. As far as the track, though, the track feels heavy. And, Apocalypse is probably pretty heavy as a theme too, but I don't really feel too much of that in the music. It feels more elated, happy, enjoying, and maybe even hopeful for the future. Whatever this is a positive notion, but the music feels aggressive and negative to me, and that's a real big schism for me as the listener. But these are just my thoughts on URNE's Setting Fire to the Sky. What did you think of this? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you'd like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Do you have your own take, perspective, or opinion on things? Let me know. Put all of that and anything else you'd like to into the comment section below. Above that, in the description box, is a link to Linktree. It takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.